because it will just help people just start to understand a few different things. So
yeah, so combat sports primarily. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Do you have a hard stop time?
I have about an hour.
Yeah, perfect.
That's okay with you.
That works. That's perfect. All right. Things are working. Let me get this one. All right. Live there. All right, we're working. No technical problems today.
Not yet.
Yeah. Perfect. Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have David Gray. Welcome, David.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to having a good chat.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on. I first came across you many years ago. It must have been during the pandemic or before the pandemic. Got your lower body basics back in the day to help some of my wife's preparation for her Olympic journey with Olympic weightlifting, and we would run that every day while we were locked down in the house. And it was definitely something different. And dude, that was lower body basics 1, and that was some of the hardest shit that I've done in terms of. I'm not going to say it's a rehab program because it's not a rehab program. It's how do you label it?
I wrote that program sitting on my couch during COVID, and it was like, okay, how can I make a bit of money? I'm booked up fully online with clients, and what are the things that I think is important for all my clients to do? We have a mix of clients. We have world-class Olympic athletes all the way down to we do work with active people who's like everyone. I only want to work with people who actually want to go for a run or do a little bit of gym or something. They don't have to be anything hectic, but I'm like, okay, regardless of all these people, I teach them certain things usually, which is like be able to move your pelvis in these ways, be able to be strong in these few ways. So it's kind of a general strength and mobility program that I start, and I use it to teach clients a few things that then I find it much easier when people do that first, and then they come to me for one-to-one, and we can be it can almost be a diagnostic tool as well, where they can just say, I just cannot do that movement, and that helps me understand, yeah, okay, it sounds like you can't internally rotate your hip, for example, or something, so general-ish strength and mobility where I like to start with clients. That's how I would try and term it, at least.
I think where it fits really well as well is people who have a very long strength sports or strength training background with, say for example, I had many years of just pure Olympic weightlifting. Yeah. And people who come from some of these backgrounds, the stiffness you get, the adaptation you get from that is being more stiff. Mm-hmm. And then you start to do some of these things like where you're moving the pelvis with the knees up and down and holding that bridge on the foam roller and things. That shit's hard. And it's stuff that you don't address or do in training because it's just not part of it. You don't need it to perform well in those sports. But then obviously when you come into things like combat sports, these are the things you probably need. So I guess regarding some of the movements in there, I guess how did you come across the pelvis? Like you addressed a lot of different things in there. Why are those things addressed in that program and maybe not some other things?
Yeah, I just think I kind of like anatomy and biomechanics, and I just like looking at the joints and seeing what joints can do or should be able to do, like the potential at the joints. So you can't move your knee like you can move your shoulder. So that's not just because that's because of the structure of the joint, how it was designed, if you want to use that word. So if your shoulder has potential to do all of these movements, then personally, I would like my shoulder to be able to do all those movements. It doesn't mean, and I don't want people to get mistaken, meaning very, very large movements, as in be like a yogi or a contortionist where you make a humongous movement like the splits or something like that. You don't necessarily need to be able to do that. Maybe you want to be able to do that, which is also fine, but at least hopefully you can go into, for your hip, flexion and extension and abduction and adduction and internal and external rotation. You can actually move somewhat in each direction that the hip could move in. And that's basically how some of those mobility type of movements are developed. It's just looking at the potential there. And then it's also looking at, okay, there's many ways we can do this, but what's the way that makes the movement the most gives people the most chance of being most accurate with the movement, because there's many ways you can trick yourself into thinking you're moving that area. You can move, trying to move your hip and you move your spine more, or you hike up, or you do lots of different things. So the movements are not just like, okay, this is a mobility exercise. It's also trying to think, okay, how can we make people be much more accurate with moving the thing they're trying to move, which is ultimately the goal, and much less having like things like different substitutions at different joints, or different compensations or strategies, or whatever word you want to put on it. So I think a lot of that just comes from anatomy, and also working with clients and being like, okay, all of these movements, people always mess these up, versus these movements, it seems to work a bit better, especially when you write a generic program like that where you're not going to be coaching someone. You have to choose the ones that are difficult, but like, yeah, people are going to hopefully be successful with.
Yeah, I think one of the, for the listeners, just to give an idea, one of the ones I quite enjoyed was you're lying on your back, your feet are against the wall, you have 90-degree knee angle, your feet flat against the wall, foam roller between your knees, and then you're moving your knees one above each other. So you're rolling the foam roller essentially back and forth, and that's moving your pelvis essentially forward and back. And the same thing, I think you had external rotation one in that position too. Yeah, those are really, really nice. And obviously with the foam roller, that kind of gives you that feedback to do it right as well, rather than having the coach there or you potentially screwing it up.
Yeah, exactly. And it looks simple a lot of the time. It looks
Yeah,
it looks
does.
like, it looks less. It looks much more. It's not something you'd see on Instagram and be like, okay, this is going to go viral, right?
Yeah.
But having said that, we've had thousands of people with a lot of hip problems do simple movements like those, and it clears it up. Not everyone, but a lot of people, and that's been very interesting. It's been like a little bit of a like research project for me in a very non-scientific way, to see the amount of people that message me saying my groin problems are gone, my hip tightness is gone. And these are people that are already very active and have like done a lot of stretching for years and a lot of different movements for years. And I can't say exactly why that stuff works a lot of the time or so much of the time, but I can say I think it's because it focuses you and gets you into such accurate movement. It gives you no choice but, like, either in that movement that you're describing, either you don't move the foam roller at all, which means your pelvis isn't moving, or you do move it, which means your pelvis kind of is moving quite nicely. And a lot of people go from not being able to do it at all to being able to do a little bit, to being able to do a lot more. And it seems to correlate with them, their hips feeling better as they do that.
You mentioned people doing a lot of different things. I mean, stretching is obviously seen as the panacea. We've covered stretching a lot on the podcast. With you don't get any structural changes in the muscle and tendon and things. But I think on a recent Instagram reel, you're talking about knees over toes. I want to take this controversial down a few different rabbit holes. And we've talked knees over toes in the podcast before about, it's obviously marketed very well. A lot of it is just kind of repackaged Poliquin stuff from back in the day. I've seen a lot of people to have different takes on, the potential for injury, running down some of these different, or at least potentially to make a lot of people's pain worse doing some of these exercises. Do you want to maybe just go through some of the thought processes?
I think it's all the movements taken individually are good movements, like nice split squats, nice, I don't know, step ups and reverse Nordics and all of that stuff. Yeah, they're all great movements. Like, we all probably use those type of movements in our programs. I think there's no more potential for injury doing those than any other movement, really. That just comes back to you being prepared for it. But I think the potential for injury comes, or aggravation comes, or causing more pain comes when you just say, these are the 6 movements that you need to do to get rid of your pain. And I think a lot of people then just follow those movements when there could be much smarter movements that they could be doing. So I don't think that their program causes more pain because of the movements they choose. I think it causes more pain because of probably how it's marketed to people, which is not necessarily knees over toes guy himself, but it seems like all of the coaches that have started to learn from that have made it worse
Yeah.
and worse and worse and worse, which tends to happen as you scale. I imagine it must be very difficult to control that, but you see a lot of weird content now about saying this is the one exercise that's going to fix your, like I saw a post the other day, like someone is doing a tibialis raise and they were saying this is going to fix your sciatica. And like, so that's probably not going to injure someone's back, but also it's very unlikely to fix someone's sciatica. So yeah, there's just a lot of weird stuff. I don't know, a lot of weird stuff. Good marketing though.
Oh, very
And it
good
does
marketing.
help.
Yeah.
It does help a lot of people too, because they're promoting movement. Like that's a
Yeah.
great thing, but it's just quite dogmatic. I think that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. That's always an issue when it becomes dogmatic. Like, if you have knee pain, do these. And it's kind of like, okay, but what's the cause of the knee pain? How long does the knee pain be there? Do these movements hurt when you do it? Like, a lot of people will probably be better off avoiding potentially these extreme knees over toes positions, and maybe squatting more of like a box squat, maybe sitting back if they're going to do something like that, potentially to kind of maybe
Yep.
still strengthen the quads and not get into those pain ranges of motion.
Yep. Just lots of maybes. Maybes. That's it.
Yeah.
Lots of maybes, and we. I see a lot of people with patellar tendinopathy all of the time, loads and loads, and obviously they naturally gravitate towards that type of training because it's marketed, and it can definitely help some people. But I think there's a much faster way to go about it, because they I think, for example, the knees over toes stuff will often sacrifice load for range of
Yeah.
motion,
Yeah.
which isn't a bad thing at all. Like it's a nice. You want to be able to get into deep knee flexion, get into full extension, but that can aggravate the hell out of a tendon if you're going into deep knee flexion without much, especially without much tension on the quads, and you're compressing the tendon all of the time. That can drive your knee berserk. I know that because I had patellar tendinopathy for a long time. You'd actually be far better off getting on, for the most part, getting on a leg extension, working through mid-range and working on loading as heavy as you can tolerate. You can probably tolerate very, very heavy loads through a middle range of motion. And I would say that you could get better. Most people can get much better, much quicker with that approach than going for the full knee flexion. And interestingly enough, if you do that approach, you'll probably end up being able to access full knee flexion and extension anyway, not because you've driven your knee forward on every movement, but because your pain is gone, or your pain is much less. And now you can get there, So just lots of maybes, which I think is important for us to keep in mind.
How would you take a similar approach for someone who maybe has some kind of maybe elbow or bicep? I don't know all the tendons in there, but around the elbow, all those tendons in there, if you have tendon pain, is that the similar approach you would take? Maybe you would do shorter range bicep curls as heavy as you can tolerate, or is it a different approach around those tendons?
It's different. It's a little bit different. But I think the principles still apply, especially for chronic tendinopathy. Not always now, because there's so many things. It could be to do with, like, it could be a nutritional thing, it can be a recovery thing, but I'm definitely generalizing, but tendons seem to enjoy heavy, slow loads. So it doesn't necessarily need to be isometrics or eccentrics or concentrics, heavy, slow loads. So the more range of motion you focus on, like, I have to get into very, very end ranges all of the time, the more you are going to have to sacrifice some load to do that. Especially less so at the elbow, but still, if your focus is on, I have to get that last millimeter of elbow flexion and supination and that last millimeter of extension and pronation, you could be sacrificing loads that you could use to actually strengthen the muscle, and that muscle will pull on the tendon more and start to cause hopefully positive adaptations. So yes, for example, I'm doing a little bit of jiu-jitsu. I'm terrible at it, but I had a guy who was pretty good in there recently, and we just had a chat before we got on the mat. I don't give anyone advice about anything, but he kind of cornered me a little bit, and he's a really nice guy. But he just said he's had an elbow tendinopathy for 2 years or something, and he showed me like the 5 or 6 stretches that the physio had given him. And I said, I'm not assessing you. I don't know anything. But if that was my elbow, I'd stop stretching it and I'd start to do some curls. It's very, very, very simple. And he came in, we met on the mats a week later. And he said, I've been doing curls. I started with a can of beans at home. Then I got like a little weight. And then I've just upped the weight a little bit from there. And he said, my elbow pain is completely gone after something like 18 months of pain. And that it's really important when I say that I'm not promising anyone else listening that that's what will happen. But that to me was just the most obvious thing in the world. Like, you know, just start to load your muscles a little bit out of a way that you can tolerate and just keep going from there. And that shouldn't be hard to get that advice. You know, you should be getting that advice from people.
Well, let's keep going on this controversial road, because we talk about advice. I titled this podcast about bird dogs are bullshit. And it's because, so my wife had a lower back injury with her lead up to the Olympics for Olympic weightlifting. So just to give some context, she was 64 kg athlete, could clean and jerk 120, front squat 141, back squat 150 kilos. And she goes into the physio, and, you know, for rehab for her back, a little bit of manual therapy, which is all good, but it's, you know, basically do 3 sets of 10 bird dogs every day as a way. And it's kind of, you're thinking like, you know, she can handle hundreds of kilos on her back. She's pulling from the floor hundreds of kilos. And then these bodyweight bird dogs are somehow going to, I don't know, rebalance, restructure. I'm not even sure what the actual outcome that you're trying to achieve for something like that is. Mm-hmm. But I'm just throwing this to you and your thoughts on maybe the traditional physiotherapy route and kind of what's being thrown at athletes or active people as a way to work around or rehab injuries.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, look, there's always a reason, a way to justify what you're doing. I'm a fan of good explanations. So if I had a chat with that physio and I said, like, why are you doing that movement? Not in a way that I'm accusing them of anything. I'm just like, can you explain your reasoning behind that? And if they had good, solid reasoning, then I'd be happy with. I might be happy with that. And maybe the reasoning could be, okay, we are trying to do some kind of anterior core strength work in a different position than weightlifting or something like that, even though it's not very much a core exercise. But maybe that's like the reason. Maybe we're trying to work on the kind of decoupling movement of the hips from the spine. So keep your spine relatively still and let's move your hips. And that could be a good reason for it. But in general, I don't think people are doing it for, maybe it's for those reasons, but I just think it's not well thought out. And if we zoom out, it's just not a very good movement. It's not a very potent movement. If I was looking at someone like that who's very, very strong, I'd be looking at, okay, are you weak in certain areas? If so, I'm going to strengthen them, which I need a more potent movement, potent stimulus to do that. Are you just not moving in certain ways, which is often the case with weightlifters, powerlifters, any sports person, actually. There's like just movements that they don't usually go into, which might be like tons and tons of flexion or tons of extension or lateral flexion or rotation or whatever, or all of these are different combinations of these. So I'd be starting to look at those type of movements. I'd be starting to look at how do your hips move, like maybe we can get a bit more out of your hips. I would also be looking at your training schedule. Like, are you just training too much, doing too much of this thing, not enough of this thing, blah, blah, blah. I'd be looking at your recovery, your stress. And I just don't think that, I think if for a lot of people, bird dogs and stuff like that works, especially for very strong people already, I think often they're used and the explanation as to why that worked is probably because you actually stopped training as hard for a little while. You backed off a little bit. Yeah. And if you just went for a walk every day instead of doing that, it probably would have worked. You just needed to chill for a week or 2 weeks or whatever. So it's a nice entry point it's potentially a nice entry point to someone who's had a major back surgery and they need to just relearn their body again. Like, here's your spine, here's your hip, and so on. But yeah, you see a lot of that stuff. And in isolation, it's fine. Like, for one client there, I chose that exercise for this reason. It's fine. But when you see that across the industry and everyone with back pain has been given bird dogs, like, yeah, it becomes a bit of a a bit of an issue, and you're like, what is this? What are we doing here? You know.
I have no context for this one, but clamshells. They're the other culprit for, I guess you could say, overprescription. What's your no context here, but if just for like maybe the active individual, is this something that's going to potentially benefit someone to do? Is there any context that you would even prescribe something like that?
Yeah, the context. I have a client that's doing quite a bit of that stuff at the moment. He actually is a professional basketballer, and he ruptured his Achilles, so he's in a boot. He can't load that limb. So he's doing loads of clamshells because he can't put his foot on the floor. So my other option is not to do anything for his hip. So he's doing clamshells. He's doing like straight leg lifts. He's doing within the gym. He's doing leg extensions, open chain. He's doing hamstring curls. He's able to do that in the boot. He's able to do some kind of hip thrust movements where he can put a certain part of the boot down. He's doing the seated abductions and adductions on the machines where you push in and you push out. He's doing all of that stuff. And even still, clamshell is like the worst movement of all of those because it's the least load and there's the least range of motion. I think the biggest problem there is the range of motion. You're taking the glute from a neutral position to a kind of a short position. And we don't really train any other muscle, particularly in that way. If you wanted to, like you're saying with a bicep curl earlier, like we would want to let the elbow extend a little bit if we're doing a bicep curl. That's where you feel that bit of stretch, and then you come back out of there. It doesn't have to be fully, but if you just do the bicep curl from a 90 degree to a top range, you're not going to get any proper load through that muscle. So the clamshell the problem is, it's again, the explanation is usually this will help your glutes activate, but your glutes are already activated unless you have some proper neurological deficit there or you've had a major injury. They can be useful post-op, definitely, better than nothing. They can even be useful for anyone to just get if you want to drive a bit of feeling into that area. Like even if let's say you were going to do an RDL and someone wasn't really aware of where their hip was, you could actually burn the crap out of that area with something like a clamshell so that they can feel their hip more and maybe they can move their hip more then straight away afterwards. But in terms of a training stimulus for the glutes, if your glutes aren't activated, which a lot of people say they aren't, that's why they prescribe those, that's definitely not going to be the thing that helps, because there's very little load there. So yeah, the range of motion is missing and the ability to actually load it is missing. And then I guess the one last thing is when you start to see fighters, rugby players, powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters using that movement and using the same color band as the granny that just had her full knee replacement.
Yeah.
That should kind of make you question, like, again, what's the point of this?
Yeah, it's often prescribed too, right? As your glutes don't activate, that's why you have lower back pain. And that's and it's kind of like you have lower back pain because you have a weak core, you can't activate your transverse abdominis, and your glutes don't turn on. That's kind of like the three-peat right there. It's kind of like is that really the reason? And then you do these low-level things, and that's supposed to fix the back pain. I'd love to go into maybe some of that back pain discussion with you. Kind of obviously, it's a very multifactorial thing, and we can't just nail it down to anything like that. But just your general thoughts on lower back pain, and I guess the training that someone can. I mean, it's so multifactorial in general, but just the general thoughts around lower back pain.
Yeah, I guess more than any other part of the body. I would say definitely more than any other part of the body. The back is like a sensitive area for us, maybe physically and emotionally. We prescribe a lot more meaning to having pain in our back than other areas in general. There's also a lot more stories told around back pain and back issues than any other area. You'll hear, like, if I have a sore shoulder, if I told my granny I have a sore shoulder, she might not say sore shoulders run in the family. But if you say you have a sore back, she'll say, well, bad backs run in the family. This is a generational thing. That is what people talk about with regards to back pain, but not really with regards to other areas. You'll also see people be very protective of when they have a sore back. So they'll be
Yes.
afraid to bend over, and that's natural. That's like that's often a smart pattern to choose. Your body is kind of making you hesitant of doing that, but initially maybe it's a smart pattern, which is like, I just hurt my back today, I don't want to bend over, or tomorrow I don't want to bend over. But when that carries over to 6 months later, I'm not bending over to pick up a pen, I'm like squatting down to pick up a pen instead of just rounding my back and picking up the pen. That can become a massive problem. So there's a lot of weird, no, I won't say weird, but there's just a lot of like cultural emotion, psychology around back pain and back issues that doesn't seem to be there for other issues. And it does make sense, because your back is a very precious area. It's a very important part of real estate, but it can still be trained like other areas. It can still adapt. It can still heal. You know, if someone hurts their back, the thought process is like, this is me done. This can't heal. Your back can heal. The areas in your back can heal. You can make it stronger. So I guess, yeah, and that's probably, you probably will see a lot of fighters as well who have back problems,
Especially jiu-jitsu.
especially jiu-jitsu. Yeah, because there's so much, because you're on your back and your side so much, you have to go into so much flexion and extension and twisting, and you have to use your back a lot. Because let's say someone has me in a mount position or in a side control position, and I need to try and like do some kind of bridge to get out of there. So much of that bridge comes from me needing to really just get into like an aggressive extension from a flexed position. So it becomes a very important area of your body to get strong, and you should, and it will get strong as you do those sports. Like if you look at people who are doing jiu-jitsu for a long time, they are very well developed. They have very mobile backs, and they have very well developed backs. Maybe not. And actually, sometimes you look at their legs and their glutes and their quads and stuff, and they are not very well developed at all. And it's because they spend so much time lying down and they use their back for so much. So maybe for those people, maybe it's not back training they need more of. Maybe it's more leg training or more whatever. Or I don't know. But I tend to look at what people are missing and kind of, if it's a big thing that's missing, like I tend to kind of start there. And I think the back should be no different.
Does that mean that you like to teach something like a Jefferson deadlift? And for anyone listening, that's like almost like a rounded back, extremely rounded back flexed, I guess, straight leg deadlift. Is that something that you would use then to help train the back? Because you mentioned about moving in all the different movements.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't. I certainly do use that some of the time, not all of the time, but I certainly do use it. And I do a lot of variations where we kind of roll down with our spine on more of a bent knee, because it makes it more spine and less kind of a hamstring stretch, if you get me. So I do a lot of bent knee versions. We kind of twist to the left and roll down. We twist to the right and roll down. We load it. I do a lot of that stuff. I also love like medicine ball throws, where we're moving from an extended into a flex position, or flexion and rotation. And I also like to do stuff with different levels of tension as well. So we do some of these movements like super duper relaxed. We do some of them much more tense, where we're lifting heavy loads. We do some of them where we're moving very fast loads, throwing and stuff like that. I find that to be very beneficial. Even if so let's say, again, going back to the jiu-jitsu example, okay, you're always in lots of spinal flexion. If you play guard a lot of the time, you're going to be in tons of flexion. Probably your lumbar spine is going to be in tons of flexion. Doesn't mean I wouldn't train you in lumbar flexion because you already are there. Maybe I'll just train you in a different type of way, so with more loads or less loads, or more speed, or more, maybe just way more relaxed. You just get a chance to sense different areas and move different parts of your spine. So yeah, I think it's all on the table. It's just about making smart choices.
Perfect. I also want to dive into some foot training, because I went down the rabbit hole a couple of years ago. I haven't really revisited it too much. There's not too many resources actually on training the feet for athletic performance, which is unfortunate. But I actually wanted to start this conversation around arches. arch foot versus flat feet. I definitely have flat feet, and I think the message throughout the years has been flat feet is bad, and you should have what are they, orthotics and all sorts of whatnot going on. I'd love to know your thoughts around flat feet versus arches and orthotics.
Yeah. So there's the I guess the research at least is starting to come out, or has been out probably for a while now, but has been more developed. Is generally speaking that there's no one good foot shape. Probably just like with regards to feet, you can also just think of probably posture. There's not necessarily one good posture. The question is like, do you have control over your movement? So for your spine, can you flex your back and extend your back? You kind of need to be able to do a bit of both to varying degrees. So with the feet, it's like, okay, can you move your feet a little bit? Can you move your ankle a little bit in different directions? That's really it. Like it doesn't, that's honestly really it. I've worked with some of the fastest sprinters in the history of the world ever. And many of the fastest people ever have quite flat feet. And these are people that their feet are striking the ground at velocities and at forces that basically no one else in the world is able to do. And their feet are quite flat. And this includes a lot of high-level basketball players as well. You'll see a lot of very flat feet. But flat doesn't mean floppy, which a lot of people think it is. It's just like a floppy fish on the end of your leg. You can see a very flat, very tense flat foot, which is often quite good for sports. Actually, you have a lot of tension in your feet. Like when you whack the ground, when you hit the ground to jump or change direction, like your foot stiffens up in a good way, and you're able to really like strike the floor and pop off of that. You see a lot of flatter feet there in a lot of very good athletes. So I think it doesn't matter too much about your foot shape. What matters is if you can get some movement there, and then are your feet strong? Like I've seen some incredibly high arched people, and the foot seems strong. If you were to just grab it in your hand, like you wouldn't be able to bend any of the bones there. It just does not move. I don't think that's strong. I just think that's rigid. The same as someone in jiu-jitsu who's a plank of wood. That's not strong. That's just rigid. You actually have to be able to move your body and be strong in different positions. Otherwise, someone just tips you over. So can it change shape, and is it strong there? And can you actually just even access those positions? So that I think that's what matters. And an orthotic can be helpful for certain people. It can definitely help not because you have flat feet, it's helping. I think it's because it can just for the time being, it can start to change how you pressurize the feet. So let's say you have a very sensitive part of your foot, and you always load that area a lot when you walk or run or jump or whatever. Like potentially an orthotic can help. I don't prescribe that, but I think it can potentially help just because it can change how your foot loads, not because it's giving you back an arch. It's just pressurizing the feet in a slightly different way. So I don't think you actually need that, though. I think you can most of the time just train your feet better, but that's also an option, I guess.
So I guess arch training exercises then don't make any sense, and they're more just general foot strengthening exercises that someone might do.
Yeah, it's movement. It's movement. They make sense in terms of like it's about the explanation. You're learning to move your feet and you're strengthening your feet, and that makes sense. That makes sense if that's a valuable thing for you as a person to focus on, and if that's something you need. That definitely makes sense. We spend a lot of time doing that, but I get a lot of people with foot issues. I get a lot of people with Achilles, calf, shin, knee issues. That definitely makes sense. I think having strong feet is really important. I think it's often undertrained, but it's just not. I do not care less about the shape that your foot presents in, other than I want to see kind of change shape a little bit from that shape to another shape, basically. But not that much. Just is there some movement there?
I'd love to go into maybe a little foot training progression, maybe off the top of your head if you've got one. Just from like level 1, you start here, and this is kind of where you want to go from there each step of the way.
Yep. It guess it depends what you need and what you're looking for. A very simple way of starting to train your feet. Let's say you're in the gym. A simple way to start to train your feet a bit more is to start to take your heels off the floor more in some exercises. So, for example, in a Bulgarian split squat, we have a foot, ankle, and Achilles program. We have a Bulgarian split squat where we go down. We take your heel off the floor of the front leg, just a bit, not a lot, and we just drive down through the foot as hard as you can through the forefoot for like 3 seconds at the bottom, and then we kind of use that tension and that push to push you back up tall. So as soon as you take the heel off the floor, you're forcing all of the toes, the arches, the ankle, the lower leg to get involved in the movement much more rather than when you have your heel down. Now, when you do that, you might maybe sacrifice some stability, and with stability comes more load. So you might not be able to load your quads quite as much or your glutes quite as much. I still think you can load them a hell of a lot if you do it right, but you might sacrifice a little bit of that. You're not going to maybe hit your 1RM squat, but you can get very close to that. But you just sacrifice a little bit of load for extra foot and ankle training. So that's a good option if you're someone that needs that. You can do that in loads of positions. But one of the best ways to strengthen your feet and ankles is to do a little bit of jumping. It's such an easy win. If you think about like a jump rope, a skipping rope, or something like that boxers do. Like that, every single time their foot hits the floor, they're getting a nice load through their Achilles, their calves, their ankles, their feet. And that might seem like a very small amount of load, but if you're someone that hasn't jumped in a while, you haven't done any jumping, which is a lot of people.
Yep.
You can feel within 30 reps, 50 reps, like 10 reps. Yeah. Like, hang on, I need to be careful here, because that's all of your body weight coming down, straight down onto maybe 1 foot. It can add up quite quickly. So jumping is amazing. Different types of jumps, different types of skips, different types of pogos, different types of speeds where you sink down a little bit more, where you try and strike the floor much faster. That's my favorite way. But not everyone can start there, but that's definitely my favorite way. That's what the feet were kind of designed for, to hit the floor and propel you back off again.
Something I started doing recently, because again, like obviously when you go through a big strength sports background and you kind of just maybe lifting for strength and size, you don't do as much jumping, sprinting stuff as maybe when you were younger. So something I started doing recently was just holding a band and doing band assisted single leg pogos. Because I found like my left side, like I can't get off the floor quick enough. It's like almost like, since I'm bigger now and everything else, it's much harder, especially when you haven't done the stuff as you got bigger. So you're like, shit, you got to basically just deload the body weight and then start trying to jump with the band and then kind of progress from there. So it's potentially somewhere someone could start too.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the more muscle you have, the more body weight you have, the harder it gets. That can help you bench press more and squat more sometimes. But maybe you haven't done any jumping along the way, so you can get humbled quickly, but not to look at that as a bad thing. It's just another thing that needs a bit of attention, a bit of training. You just need to be slow with it in that case, because when you add a lot of force and a lot of speed together, things can go wrong, especially like tendons can not like it. So it's just something, but it doesn't mean you need to be scared of it. You just need to be smart with it. That's all.
Do you recommend doing these in shoes or no shoes?
I prefer no shoes if it's an option, but I wouldn't let it hold me back. If I was in a gym and I didn't want to take off my shoes, or I wasn't allowed, or I was outside on concrete, I do some kind of pogo type of work probably 5 days a week with clients, just because I'm showing them, I'm doing different positions. I could be barefoot, I could be in shoes. I prefer barefoot if I have the choice, but I don't think it matters that much. Don't let it hold you back.
Perfect. And what about specific toe training? Because we can train the feet, and obviously the toes are involved in a lot of these things we're doing, but there's obviously like toe curls where you're curling up like a towel and things like that. Is that anything you go down?
only if I have someone with a toe problem, basically. That's almost it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if they have a plantar fasciitis type of problem or something close to the toes, but in terms of a general training program, if you don't have a toe problem, your toes are fine. I don't think you need to do. I think you could waste a lot of time doing toe work unless for some reason you checked your toe and like you can't lift your big toe or something. Like you just can't lift it, or
Dude,
you
I'm pretty
can't
sure I
flex
can't.
it.
Like you mean by keeping all your toes on the ground and only your big toe comes off the floor,
that's
right?
more of a motor
No,
control
different.
thing. Let's just
Okay.
say like you can't lift your toe, like all the toes or something.
Okay. No,
Because that's
that's not
kind of
me.
a party. That's kind of a party trick. Like, can you lift your first toe, your second toe, all individual? Like
Dude,
that.
that's hard.
I don't care about that. Yeah, you can
Okay,
only do
perfect.
that if you practice that. Also, these amazing athletes that I'm talking about, the sprinters, the basketballers, they definitely cannot do that. No chance in hell that they can do that, and they can still jump higher and run faster than anyone else in the world. So, unless you have a toe problem, I don't think you need to do toe training. Unless you like
Perfect.
it. Some people just enjoy that stuff.
Who enjoys training their toes? Toe day.
Yeah. Yeah, I do actually have a post on Instagram which is Big Toe Day, but that was for a guy with a big toe problem.
Oh man, yeah. You see a lot of different stuff around the toe training and foot training. Like, I went through. It was a Cal Dietz and Chris Corfus course a few years ago around the ankle rocker.
Yep.
And yeah, it was interesting going through that and kind of moving the feet. And, talking a lot of stuff you're talking there around, the foot should be able to move. Like, if you manipulate the foot and like with your hands, it should like the bones should move past each other, all that kind of stuff. It was quite good. I know one of my ankles is definitely stuck. Like, I literally cannot get more flexion because there's something that just stops it in the way. So it's like ankle rocker there probably doesn't quite work. But yeah, I like those ideas around foot training. Just simple plyometrics, jumps, more floating heel or just heel off the ground strength training exercises, and you can just incorporate those in and basically improve your foot strength.
Yeah, they're easy to incorporate. They don't take that much extra time. And the cool thing is, like, you're going to get a lot of good stuff along the way where you get your calves, you get your shin muscles, you get your feet, you get your ankles. Whereas the toe thing is like, you're just getting your toe. That's the only thing. So, yeah, I do really like all that ankle stuff. I think that's very beneficial for a lot of people.
We actually mentioned about the tib raises with the sciatica. Obviously, the tib raise is blowing up because of the knees over toes movement as well. Are tib raises ever within a training program for you, or do they serve any kind of purpose for you?
No, almost never. If someone has a shin splint problem, a true shin splint problem, maybe I will put it in there for a couple of weeks or maybe longer because I don't see any harm in it.
Yeah.
They might get some kind of pump in that area. It might help them load that area. I don't see any harm in it. It's just another fine movement that's like, okay, I can load the front of your shins. But again, it comes back to the explanations around. There's some weird stuff being said that the tibialis anterior is the most important muscle in your body. It helps your back pain, your knee pain. It doesn't even touch your knee. It doesn't touch your back. So, yeah, but even with shin splints, like, I help a lot of people with shin splint issues, ankle impingement type of issues, knee problems. And 98% of those people, we never give a tib raise to. Yeah, I think, look, they aren't probably doing any harm. They would, if you threw it into your program and you enjoyed it, it wouldn't do any harm. It's not going to hurt you, or unlikely unless you did something weird. But you have to look at bang for your buck as well. Like, how often, how much time do you have in your week? How many exercises do you actually want to do? And then you need to choose the most potent ones, the most important ones for you. And very rarely does that end up with me giving people loads of tib raises.
It's funny, like, coaching how many years in like professional sport, talking about how many other coaches and stuff, like the tib raise or the tibialis anterior was never mentioned once in my entire like career coaching, anything like that. Then suddenly, like in the past few years, it's like all that's talked about all over the internet. You're like, but you saw any coaches it will never come up once.
Mm-hmm.
It won't come up once, but now,
Yeah.
marketing's good.
You know who it might be useful for is jiu-jitsu, because they have to. They're using so much hooking of their foot.
Yeah, that's true.
But they're on the flip side, they're already usually very strong there. They're doing so much, like so much of that is like pulling back and lifting people there and stuff like that. So they will have, and actually, again, jiu-jitsu people will usually have very strong, not necessarily feet in terms of jumping for impact, but like, yeah, when they pull back, they'll be quite strong. When they press away, they'll be quite strong in those positions.
Yep.
Turning the feet, they'll be quite strong in those positions. So potentially, I could see some value there in doing some of that. But that's maybe the only sport. Yeah.
Perfect. I think that's everything I had for you to ask, David. Where can people find and follow you and keep up with what you're doing?
I guess Instagram is probably the best place. My name is David Gray, Grey, rehab on Instagram, and that's usually a good place because people can come and have a look and see some of my content and decide do they hate it or not, which maybe they will, maybe they won't. And then we also have a podcast, which I've learned recently, when you're on a podcast, you should plug your own podcast, because podcast listeners listen to other podcasts. So yeah, our podcast is called the David Gray Rehab Podcast, and I do a lot of some guest episodes, but mostly kind of solo episodes where I just get asked a couple of questions and I just riff on it for a while, answer them for a while, and it does pretty well, actually. People seem to enjoy it. It's quite lighthearted and just definitely built for coaches and therapists who are interested in like just learning a little bit more. So those are the two main places, I think.
Perfect. I'll link those up in the description too. So make sure you check David out on Instagram, check out his podcast as well, give that a listen. But I appreciate you coming on, David, and sharing some of your knowledge and your time.
Thanks so much, James. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed the chat, and keep doing what you're doing.
Cheers.